Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Samach Gimel contains one Mishnah. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah is the conclusion of the discussion about what happens when you shech the carbon Pesach or do any of the other avodos of the carbon, and you have in mind, or you're including both people who have a bris milah and people who do not. Obviously, people without a bris milah are puzzled to be part of the carbon, and we've been discussing whether that ruins it for everybody else or not. Then we'll get to the Mishnah, which introduces the psul of having chametz in your possession at the time of doing the avodos of the carbon Pesach. The Mishnah and the Gemara that follows will discuss which karbanos it applies to and which people involved in the carbon are not allowed to own chametz at the time that the carbon is brought. So we're in the middle of this discussion about milah. We know that if you bring a carbon Pesach and some of the people that are involved, some that you have in mind, have a bris milah and some do not, that's okay, as long as there's at least one person there who has a bris milah who's going to be eating from it. The entire shechita is considered to having been necessary for that person to eat. It's a kosher shechita, and same for the rest of the avodos. Now, the brisa we're about to quote has an interesting halacha, and the Gemara has three approaches to try to explain what the brisa is talking about. The Brisa only quotes one opinion, but there are two opinions involved. The Brisa is discussing what happens if you first have kavana. When we say kavana, we always mean that you speak it out. You first say that I'm doing this for people with a bris milah, and then you say I'm doing it for people without a bris milah, or vice versa. So the Brisa says whichever one goes first is what sets the halacha. If you first say it's for mulim, and then arelim, mulim people with a bris milah, and arelim people without. If you first say for mulim and then arelim, it's kosher. If you first say arelim and then you say mulim, it's pasul. So the Gemara says that doesn't make sense. We already said if it's partially for people with a bris milah, that's okay. Why should it be a difference which one's first? So the Gemara has three approaches to this. Now, this Brisa quotes the opinion of Acherim, which the Gemara is going to assume is Rabbi Meir. Acherim was name that was applied to Rabbi Meir's halachas that he learned from Elisha ben Avuya. So we're assuming that this is Rabbi Meir, and this is a brisa that comes from Mesachos Menachos, and there the Rabbanan argue, and they say that it's kosher either way. It doesn't make a difference. So the Gemara's first explanation is that the machlokes is about the concept called Eino l'shchita elo lebasar, which means the shchita is a long process. You have to cut the two simanim of the animal. You have to cut the majority of both of them. So you cut one, you cut the majority of one, it's not finished. You have to cut through the second one when you cross the 50% mark of cutting the second siman. And again, the two simanim are the esophagus and the trachea, the windpipe and the food pipe. So when you cut through the second one, that is when the shechita is completed. Now, it's a very quick process. It takes a second or two, but what happens along the way? And it's problematic because if it's not shechita yet, then the animal's treif. So how do you view it? So there is a machlokus which appears in a number of masechtas. It appears in Chulin, it appears in Tzvachim. Do we say eino l'shchita ela b'sof or not? Do we say that the entire process of cutting is part of the shechita, or do we say that the concluding hair's breadth, where you finish the shechita of the second siman, that's the shechita? Everything before that is just kind of setting up the shechita. Now, the Gemara wants to say that this machlokus will be as follows. According to the one who says that when you say arelim first it's pasul, we're holding ein l'shchita ela lebasov. That means that the time of the actual shchita, the avod of shchita, is just one split instantaneous a second when you cut that last hair's breadth, and during that time you only have you only have space to have kavana for one thing, either for arelim or for mulim. So if you said arelim first, then it's all arelim, and then it's pasul because there are no mulim involved. By the time you think to include mulim, the shechita is already over. If, however, you said mulim first, then it's considered to be all for mulim. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and that's why he says it makes a difference which one you say or have kavana for first. Going to Chachamim, the entire shechita is considered part of the shechita. All the cutting, from the beginning of the cutting until the end of the completion of rov of the second siman, is all part of the shechita, and therefore you could fit two kavanas in. You could say arelim and mulim, mulim and arelim. Either way, it's partially for both, and as long as it's partially for mulim, it's okay. So the Gemara says not necessarily is this the right explanation. In this machlokus, Rabbi has a different shot. Rabbi says really everybody can hold yeshna l'shchita mitchila vatzav. Now we don't want to be stuck saying that it's a machlokus about yeshna l'shchita or einay l'shchita, because in Mesachos Menachos we make that a machlokus between Rav and Abaye. We don't want to line up a machlokus Tanaim with a machlokus Amoraim like that. Machlokus Rava and Abaye is about a different sugya. It's about when somebody says two contradictory things, which one do you accept? And we end up with a proof based on the concept of shchita ola b'seif. So anyway, so Rabbi says we have a different pshat over here, and what's actually happening is as follows. The sheichet, the one who performed the shechita, had in mind one thing, and he spoke with his mouth a different thing. Now, the speaking is really what determines the kavanah, but that's actually going to be the issue over here. He had in mind it should be for both arelim and mulim. But he said one, and he didn't get a chance to say the other until the shechita was finished. Meaning we could all be holding that the entire shechita, the entire process of cutting counts as shechita, but still it could be that he didn't fit in both words, for arelim and for mulim, he didn't fit in both kavanas within the shechita, one was too late. So, according to the opinion that says that it goes by what you have in mind, and it doesn't matter only what you say, what your mind is involved, so since he had in mind it should be for both people, both for Arelim and for Mulim. Therefore, it counts as it's for both people, and it's kosher even if he said Arelim first. According to Rabbi Meir, though, who is Acherim, we don't care what he said, we don't care what he had in mind, we're only interested in what he said, and the words that he spoke, only one of them was within the Shechita, and therefore if he said Mulim first, it's kosher, if he said Arelim first, then it's all Arelim, and it is possible. The Gemara says the problem with this is that you're pinning down that Rabbi Meir says that we don't care what you say, we only care what you, we don't care what you think, we only care what you say. Well, that's not true. Rabbi Meir very much is concerned to make sure that what you say and what you think are lined up, and what you're thinking is very much a part of it. How do we see that? From a Brisa, quoting nobody, so it's a Stam, a Brisa, which is always Rabbi Meir. It's a Mishnah, it's a Stam, a Mishnah, which is Rabbi Meir. And he's talking about where somebody says the wrong thing, he's thinking one thing and he says something else. And over there we'll see the halach is that you got to have them both be the same, otherwise it doesn't work. What's the discussion there? So the Mishnah says somebody who says that something's truma, and he meant to say meiser, or he says it's meiser and he meant to say truma. Or he said, I'm not ever walking into this house. He made a neder, I'm never going to walk into this house, but he was really thinking he was referring to a different house. Or he said, I'm never having hana, I'm never having any benefit from this person. He was thinking a different person. So what he said and what he thought didn't line up. So Rabbi Meir says it's problematic. It doesn't count. The neder isn't chal, and the truma isn't chal. Truma is a type of neder also. It's not chal until you're thinking and you're saying both the same thing. Says Abaye, there's a third explanation of what this machlokes is about, and that's he had different things in mind when he cut the first siman, when he cut the trachea, then when he cut the second siman, when he cut the esophagus. When he cut the first siman, he only had one group of people in mind. The second one, he had both in mind. So when we say he first had Arelim and then Mulim, we mean first had Arelim and then he added Mulim and he had both. Or in the vice versa, he first had Mulim, then he added Arelim and then he had both in mind. So the second siman was kosher in all situations because he did the second siman with both groups in mind. The first siman, it depends. If he had Mulim in mind, it's kosher. If he had Arelim in mind, it's pasul. Should be, but that is what Rabbi Meir says. Now the Chachamim disagree, and the Chachamim say you can't have a psul and half a siman. And this is a discussion which we've seen in Hilchas Pigul. If somebody has a pigul, a pasaling kavana in one part of the avodas required to make the carbon serviceable. So according to Rabbi Meir, that is a psul on the carbon. According to Chachamim, it's not. So the Chachamim here say, listen, the worst case scenario is that you cut one siman with the wrong kavana. If you said arelim and you had in mind that the first siman should be only for arelim, that's only a psul in part of the shechita. Part of a shechita can't pasul the entire shechita. That concludes this discussion. The Gemara now goes to the Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses the psul of having chametz in your possession when you're bringing the carbon. The Gemara will discuss if it applies to a carbon Pesach, other carbonos that are brought on the 14th on Erev Pesach, whether they're carbon Pesach or not, and carbonos that have the wrong kavana, that you brought them to be a carbon that they weren't originally designated for. Where does this psul of having chametz in your possession apply? And so we begin the Mishnah. The Mishnah has four opinions. The first one says that if somebody shechts a carbon Pesach with chametz in his possession in the right time, the right place, everything's good. But he has chametz, that is when he violates the Isser D'Oraisa, Lo Yishachar El Chametz Am Zivchi. You cannot own chametz while you are bringing the carbon Pesach. Says Rabbi Yehuda, that also applies to the carbon Tamid Shel Bein Arabayim of Erev Pesach. It's not only the carbon Pesach that this applies to, that carbon is included as well. Now, Rabbi Shimon says there are a number of factors involved over here. And the halacha is different for Karban Pesach and for other Karbanos, and it's different on Erev Pesach and for the rest of the Pesach Yom Tov. There's halacha you cannot have chametz both on Erev Pesach by the time of the shechita of the carbon and the rest of Pesach as well. The same Isser applies. And it also applies not only to a Karban Pesach but to other Karbanos. The difference will be that a Karban Pesach and also Karban Chatas, if you shechted for the wrong name, for the wrong intent of carbon, it's puzzle. The carbon's puzzle, you're not violating the Isser of having chametz at the time of the shechita because the shechita is puzzle. Other Karbanos are kosher even if they're shechted for the wrong name, and therefore you are violating the Isser. The exception being on Erev Pesach, because on Erev Pesach you only violate the Isser for Karban Pesach and not for other types of Karbanos. Now, there is one situation in which a Karban Pesach is kosher even if it's the wrong name, and that's if it's not the time to bring a Karban Pesach itself. If it's not the right time for a Karban Pesach, then it reverts to becoming a shlamim, and then it's kosher if you bring it as a shlamim. So Reb Shimon discusses his halacha as follows. He says, the Karban Pesach, the halacha is as follows. If you shechted on Erev Pesach, it's a kosher carbon, and you have chametz, you violate the Isser. If you shechted on Pesach itself, then it's not a kosher Karban Pesach. So, if you shecht it as a Karban Pesach, there's no problem, because it's not a Karban Pesach, you didn't violate any Isser, it's a Pasul Shchita, and therefore there's no Isser of Shechting Chametz. If, however, you bring it as a Karban Shlamim, which is what it now is, then it's a proper carbon, and the Isser of not having Chametz applies. Even though it's not a Karban Pesach, it applies to every carbon, and therefore you're violating the Isser. Now, other Kabbanos besides for Chatas. Other Kabbanos, if you bring them on Erev Pesach for their proper intent, you didn't violate the Isser, because the Isser of Chametz is exclusive to a Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach itself. Certainly, if you bring it as a different carbon, it's certainly not violating Isser, because it's a puzzle carbon. If you bring it as its proper carbon on Pesach itself, you do violate the Isser. And even if you bring it as its proper carbon, even if you bring it as an improper carbon, if it's supposed to be one carbon and you bring it as a different carbon and it's done on Pesach itself, you still violate the Isser, because wrong type of carbon is not a psol in other carbonos besides for the carbon Pesach and the carbon Chatas. Carbon Chatas would have that halacha. If you bring it as a wrong carbon on Pesach, it's still puzzle, and therefore you would not violate the Isser of shechting the carbon Pesach, of shechting a carbon on Pesach while owning chametz. Okay, we now begin the Gemara. The Gemara has two discussions. One is about which people involved in the carbon would passel it if they own chametz, and the Gemara is going to mention that first, but its first actual discussion will focus on where does the chametz have to be to passel the actual carbon. So the Gemara begins by quoting Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan. Reish Lakish says it's got to be that the chametz belongs to the person who does the shechita, does the zrika, or one of the people who's involved, registered in the chabura, the group that's going to eat the carbon Pesach. Any of these people owning chametz passels the carbon. And now our main discussion, which is where does the chametz have to be? Reish Lakish says the chametz has to be in the azara, in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash where the shechita is happening. If he owns it elsewhere, it's not a psol. Rav Yochanan says no, even if it's not in the azara, even if he just owns it somewhere else, it still passels the carbon itself. Now the Gemara wants to understand what is this machlokes about. What are they arguing over? So Gemara's first attempt is maybe they're arguing over the meaning of the word al. It says le'sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Al chametz should mean near chametz. It's got to be right near the chametz. That would be Reish Lakish's opinion. It's got to be right near there, and therefore it has to be in the azar. Rav Yochanan says no, al doesn't mean it has to be near, and even if it's anywhere else, it's still a psol. It just means that it's while you have it. Says the Gemara, that can't be the machlokes, because we've seen that machlokes in Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish elsewhere. Where do we see it? In the discussion about the breads of the carbon taida. The carbon taida comes with 40 loaves of bread, 30 chametz and 10 matzah. But that those breads, so where do they get the kedusha of the carbon? When you first makdish them, they only have kedushas damim, that is, they have the value of the fact that they're being set aside to serve a carbon. They're not actually called carbon bread yet until the carbon is actually shechted. Now, the carbon has to be nearby to the breads in order for the kedusha to go onto the breads itself. That's clear. The question is, how near do they have to be? So Reish Lakish says it's got to be right there. It's got to be in the azar with them, because it says al, the pasuk describing the avoda of the Carbon Taida uses the word al, so it's got to be nearby. Rav Yochanan says no, it doesn't have to be nearby. It just has to be within Yerushalayim. It can't be further than the base Pagi. That's the edge of Yerushalayim, because outside Yerushalayim is a psul. It passels the carbon Taida and all its breads. This has got nothing to do with the word al. So we already see Machokas Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish whether the word al implies nearby in the Azar or not. Why would we repeat it again here? So the Gemara offers a different explanation, and the Gemara ends up going back to the original explanation. The Gemara wants to say, maybe the Mechakas Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish about whether it has to be in the Azara is over the concept of Hasra'as Safek. In order for someone to get a punishment of Malchus, he needs to be warned. We have to tell him, we're warning you, if you do what you're about to do, you're going to get Malchus. That means we are telling him you're going to get it. What if we're not sure? What if we say, if you do your about to do, you might get Malchus depending on some other things. That's the Machlokes. According to Reish Lakish, we would say that it's got to be right there, because if it's a Hasras Safek, because if it's not right there, we don't know for sure that you actually own Chametz. If we see the Chametz is there, we know you own Chametz, we could tell you straight up, you shech that carbon now, you're going to be violating an Isser D'Oraisa, you're going to get Malchus. And therefore it's got to be there, because if otherwise it's Hasra Safek, and Hasra Safek is no good. But Rav Yochanan says, no, it's fine, it's a good enough Hasra. We tell him, if you own Chametz in your house, we don't know if you do, if you don't, but if you do, and you go ahead and check that carbon you're about to do, you're gonna get Malchus. And therefore, that is the Machlokes between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, whether the Chametz has to be in the Azar there with you or not. Is it problematic if it's not? Because it'll be Hasras Safek, a unclear warning. Says the Gemara, very nice, but we've already seen this Machlokes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish about Hasras Safek before. Where do we see it? We saw it in the case of somebody who makes a neder, that he's going to eat something, and he is not eating the thing that he said that he's going to eat. So, Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish there both agree that he doesn't get Malchus if the day he says, I will eat it today, and the day ends and he didn't eat it, doesn't get Malchus for that. And they argue what the reason is. According to Reish Lakish, the reason is because it's a Hasra'as Safek, and it's a warning that's dependent on a suffix. When at the time we warn you, and you say, listen, if you don't eat that thing right now, you're going to get Malchus. It's not really true, because even if you don't eat it now, you might eat it later. The day's not over. There's always a fraction of a day left, no matter when we warn you. So we can't say to him, honestly, if you do not eat that piece of bread right now, you're going to violate the Isser. The day will be over, and you violated your own neder, and therefore you'll get Malchus for that. It's not entirely true. We're still suffix, because you may eat it later. So that's called Hasra Safek, and therefore you don't get Malchus for that. That's Reish Lakish's opinion. Rav Yochanan says it's got nothing to do with Hasra Safek. Hasra Safek is not a problem. The problem over here is that you didn't do anything Asr. You neglected to do something, and that's where the problems began. But for neglecting to do things, there's no Malchus. You only get a Malchus for doing something in a proactive, positive way that is an Isser. Now, so again here we see Machlokes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish whether Hasra Safek is a problem or not. So the Gemara says, you know what, I'm going to go back to my first explanation. The argument is over the word al, but I need the machlokes to be said twice. I need it to be said in the case of the carbon toida and the klisharis, and I need it to be said here in the case of the chametz. Why? It's far more likely that we should interpret al to mean that it has to be really nearby in the case of the carbon toida, where you are trying to put kedusha's carbon onto the breads. And the reason is because we know that proximity has a lot to do with kedusha's carbon applying to things. As a matter of fact, one of the main ways in which Kedusha's carbon is applied to things is by touching the klisharis, by touching the tools used in the Beis HaMikdash that are sanctified. That's where the Kedusha goes on to the things. So there, it's very likely, and it's mistaber. However, concerning violating the Isser, if you own chametz, why should that have to be nearby? It's far more likely that you wouldn't say that. Therefore, if we only said the machlokes between Yochanan and Reish Lakish in the case of the carbon taida kedusha going on, I would have said there, everybody agrees, that you, if you would have only said it there, and I would know that they argue there, then I would say that's the case where The opinion that says that it has to be nearby says it has to be nearby. But maybe as far as applying Isser of Leisi Shachet, everybody would agree that it doesn't apply. You don't have to be so close. And if I only said it in the case of the Isser of Leisi of having Chametz, Leisi Shachet, then I would think that's where there's a Machlokes. But the other way around, in the case of where it's by the Kedushas carbon applying to the breads of the carbon tight over there would be no Machlokes. Everybody would agree that it does have to be nearby. The one who argues about the Chametz would not argue here. He would agree because it's far more likely to have to be nearby. Okay, now we move on to the topic of who. Who will passel the carbon if he owns Chametz? So the Gemara says there was a question that was asked by Rav Oishia to Rabbi Ami. The shoichet, we know if the person who's shechting, if he has chametz, is definitely a psul. What if he doesn't have one of the other people that are registered to the carbon to eat it? They have chametz. So he says, what do you mean? For sure, that passels the carbon. It doesn't say lo yishachet al chametzecha. It doesn't say don't shecht it when you, the shechter, are owning chametz. It says don't shecht it on chametz. There shouldn't be any chametz involved. So he says, what do you mean? That means that if there's chametz anywhere in the world, if somebody on the planet owns chametz, so that's a problem, because it doesn't have to be just on chametz. Chametz exists. So he says, no. Because if you look, the next phrase in the pasuk is v'lo yalon laboiker. You shouldn't leave it over till the morning. So the two isurim are linked: the isur of owning chametz and the isur of leaving the carbon over to the morning after the seder night. Those two isurim are linked. Whoever is involved in the isur of leaving this carbon over is involved in the isur of owning chametz while this carbon is brought. Who's involved in the isur? So that refers to the bnei achabura, the people that are included in the shechita. And therefore, because they would violate the Isser of Baltalin if they left it over, they'll also violate the Isser of Leisi Shachet if they own Chametz. Says Rav Papa, that being the case, it also applies to the person who burns the emurim, the parts that go in the fire of the Mizbeach. The person who burns them, if he owns Chametz, he also passels the carbon. And ordinarily, he's not considered to be a central part of the avoda because it's not a blood avoda. But here we say he will pass it. Why? Because he has an isser to leave it over till the morning. Those limbs, those emurim, have to go in the fire still tonight. Can't be left for the morning. And therefore, he also is included in the isser baltalan. He'll also be included in the isser leisi shachet. So the Gemara is a brisa that very much supports Rav Papa's assertion. The brisa says, somebody who shachs a carbon pesach and there's chametz violates any loisa, say in the Torah, owning chametz creates the iser. So there's shaychid if the slaughter owns chametz, or the zarik, someone sprinkles the blood, owns chametz, or one of the people that are in the chabura, one of the people that are registered. Any of these people owning chametz makes the psal. Somebody in the end of the world, not a problem. And then we say again, it's got to be the shaychid, the zarik, and now we add also the makdir, the one who puts the emurim in the fire of the mizbeach. Now the brayso here continues, and it says somebody who does malika on a bird, meaning he brings a carbon oif, a carbon of a bird, on erev Pesach. If he has chametz, no problem. Now Rashi points out it doesn't have to be a bird. Any carbon, we said in our Mishnah, any carbon that you bring while you're owning chametz on erev Pesach, even if it's a kosher carbon, you do it 100% correctly, there's no problem. On erev Pesach, the Yisr only applies to the carbon Pesach itself, or according to Yehuda, to the carbon Talmud. So now the Gemara says, I have another brisa which contradicts a couple of the halachas in this one. This brisa says as follows: somebody who shachs the carbon Pesach and there's chametz violates a loisase. Rabbi Yehuda says it also applies to a carbon Talmud. So far, it's the same as our Mishnah. Then the brisa continues, and they said to him, "No, the iser of having chametz only applies to carbon Pesach." When the brisa continues, where if the shaychet has chametz, or the zayrik has chametz, or any of the people that are involved that are signed up, the bnei chabur have chametz. But somebody at the end of the world is not a problem. Now, but it does apply to, and this is beginning to get redundant, and here it's going to contradict, it does apply to the shaychet, the slaughterer, the zayrik, the one that sprinkles the blood, somebody who does a melika, somebody who does that's the way you kill a bird for a carbon, and somebody who sprinkles, that's the blood of other karbanos. Well, you don't do zrika, you do sprinkling. But if it's a carbon mincha and somebody does kamitza, which is like the shechita of a carbon mincha, then there's no Isser. And then we add in the last line, the Makdir Murim, the one who puts the pieces into the fire, doesn't violate any Isser. So Gemara says there's two halachas here which contradict the brisa which we brought before. Here it says that it does apply to bird karbanis and other karbanis, and before we said that it does not. And here we say that the one who's Makdir, the one who puts the pieces into the fire, doesn't violate the Isser, and before we said we do. So Gemara says you're asking a contradiction between these two brises. This last brise is self-contradictory itself. It starts off saying it only applies to a carbon Pesach, and then it says a bird or another carbon where you sprinkle blood instead of spritzing blood. So it's self-contradictory. What's going on? So obviously we have to say the following thing. The fact that one talks about different karbanis and one brise doesn't talk about, one says it's only the carbon Pesach itself, that's because, like we saw in our Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon says there's a difference as far as other karbanos are concerned on the 14th of Nisan, the day of the carbon Pesach, and Chal Hamoed Pesach. Chal Hamoed, other karbanos do have the Isser of owning chametz while you do the shechita or any of the avodas. On Erev Pesach, they don't apply to other karbanos. So this brise is not contradictory because one's talking about on Erev Pesach and one's not. And it's not contradictory to our other brise also because one's talking about Erev Pesach and one's not. Now the only question that you're left with is why does one say that the person who puts the pieces in the fire is everyone says it's not? So that's a machlokes. Machlokes do we hold of this drasha of connecting shechita to haktara or...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.